distinguished panelists. Just a few housekeeping things for those both here, but also joining us online. So for online participants, anyone who's on the attendee hub in need of translation, you can press the translation button on the right-hand side and choose your language. And if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please post your questions via the Q&A button on the attendee hub. And we have a chat moderator who will be tracking these and also sharing and responding to these questions. For in-person participants, so those here in the room, please raise your hand during the Q&A session. So we'll have an introduction, we'll have a moderator panel discussion. We want to really hear from you and your questions. Please make sure to raise your hand, and we'll go between both kind of room questions and online questions during the discussion. Thank you so much. Over to you, Joel.
Great. Thank you, Miguel. And it's a pleasure to be here. I'm Joel Hellman. I'm Dean of the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, just down the street. But I was a former staff member here at the World Bank, and actually very pleased that the first Fragility Forum, we were established the first Fragility Forum when I was director here at Fragility, Conflict, and Violence way back when, 15 years ago. And it's such a pleasure to see it becoming such an important part of the annual calendar of events and bringing together people from around the world who are deeply interested in this set of topics. So it's with some pride that I see this group and this distinguished panel and this wonderful audience to discuss a very, very important topic indeed. I am going to very briefly introduce the speakers, because if I gave a true time to their impressive biographies, we wouldn't have very much time to talk about anything else. So I will just tell you their current positions, and then we will head right into some rounds of questions for the panelists here in person and then online. And then I do plan to leave time for questions. So I hope you'll be ready with questions. Let me start right here on my left. We're very pleased to have Elizabeth Spehar, the UN Assistant Secretary General for Peacebuilding and Support, who's had 35 years of experience in international and political affairs and working at the United Nations headquarters and in the field. Next to her, we have Sheila Braca-Mussini, the World Bank Deputy General Counsel for Operations, and she has had a really long and important career managing the World Bank's operational portfolios and engagement, and really understands the kinds of operations and flexibility one needs to work effectively in fragile and conflict-affected states, having worked in Africa and the East Asia and Pacific. Next to her, we have Dr. John Fayemi. He's visiting professor at the African Leadership Center at King's College and former governor of the Ekiti State in Southwest Nigeria and former Nigerian Minister of Mines and Steel Development. And online, we have two distinguished participants who unfortunately were not able to get their visas here, a sign of the times here in the United States, I'm afraid. But we have Ambassador Maman Nuhu, the former Executive Secretary of the Lake Chad Basin Commission and head of the mission of the Multinational Joint Task Force. He's a retired diplomat from the Foreign Service in Nigeria. And finally, we have from Somalia, Kamal Gutale, who is the permanent secretary in the office of the Prime Minister of Somalia, and has been playing several roles in Somalia over the course of the last few years. So with that, I'm going to get right into a set of questions, and I'll ask a specific question to each one of the panelists, and then try to take the conversation from there. Let me start with Elizabeth Spehar and the United Nations. Of course, the United Nations works across FCV contexts. Can you tell us a little bit about when collaboration between development and security actors actually worked in your experience? And what are really the conditions that you've seen that need to be in place to make that cooperation work effectively?
Is this, oh, it's working already. Wonderful. Yes, well, thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here. I think this is my second or third Fragility Forum, so I've become somewhat of a regular and always find it very stimulating and a great place to meet up with colleagues from both the World Bank, but also the regional development banks, the think tanks, government partners, civil society. As you say, it really has become a very important forum, and long may it live and continue to attract such interesting and important and consequential people. Well, what you're asking about is, I would say, really important. I mean, security and development do go together. They have to go together in these fragile and conflict-affected contexts. I think one of the problems we have, including within the UN, but also more broadly in terms of the international actors, is that we have put very important issues in convenient silos, convenient mostly to us. But if you're talking about effectively operating on the ground, I dare say that that model very quickly shows a lot of problems. And so I would mention three basic things that need to be there in order for us to be more effective and for things to work between the security and the development actors, so how we can collaborate better. And one is precisely to have a much more integrated approach to what we do. We sometimes talk also sequentially. That also, I think, has proven not to work very effectively. And what I have seen work the most effectively in various contexts is that we are all working in a more very deliberate, complementary way, joined up way, based on a shared vision and overall common objectives. Of course, we all have our specific mandates. We have specific objectives that we are supposed to be attaining. That's all very true. But we need to have that overarching common, if you will, North Star. Extremely important. And that will make us, I think, deliver much more effectively. We do have some tools for that already, and I'll bring this into the context of the World Bank here. Something that I think has proven to be quite useful in different contexts is integrated analysis and planning. We have a tool which is known by its acronym, because the UN lives and dies by its acronyms, the RPBA, so the Resilience and Peacebuilding Assessment. And that is something that the UN, the EU, and the World Bank do sometimes to basically join up their analyses, look at what is happening on ground, try to see where the priorities lie, and then try to work again in a more coordinated and joined up fashion. So these RPBAs are something, it's a tripartite arrangement between the three institutions that I think we've piloted in different countries. I think they've worked quite well, but we haven't been using them so much lately. So maybe we need to go back to that, or perhaps a lighter version of that, which we've been discussing as partners. But linked to that, very importantly, because you may have noticed I might have skipped a few actors, very importantly is the issue of national ownership and basically anchoring whatever we are doing in national strategies, policies, and plans. This might seem like an obvious thing to say, but in terms of our peace operations, of course, we do have Security Council mandates most of the time, sometimes GA mandates, and sometimes there's a question about, okay, well, where is the host government in all of this? If we're looking at sustainable security and development work, joined up work, we need to make sure that we're addressing this issue of working not just alongside the national authorities, but basically that they are the ones who are mapping out the priorities that we should be addressing, that we should be responding to. And thirdly, I think our support, when it works best between the security and the development actors, is when we have a long-term perspective in front of us in terms of where we think we can go. I say that again because peace operations, which is one of our important instruments on ground in a number of fragile and conflict-affected contexts, are by their nature supposed to be temporary, short-term, short to medium-term. Some of them become quite long-term, but the premise of those instruments is that they are basically there for a certain critical amount of time to accomplish a certain amount of tasks. But even there, we need to be working together to make sure that whatever we are trying to deliver at UN through those types of mechanisms, that it is rooted in a broader perspective about how we're going to help consolidate peace and security in that context and support sustainable development over time. And that can't be an afterthought once you're already packing up and leaving. And we need to all think that way and work together in that respect.
Can I ask you? You talked about the importance of international peace missions, and that has been an important forum for this integrated approach or supported approach. With international peace missions now to some extent scaling back, how do you continue the progress that has been made, or even further progress in the absence or with the scaled back notion of these peace missions?
Yeah. Well, I think there are some really key things we need to be doing, and it actually links up quite a bit to what I've just been talking about. So one of them is that we really need to have that longer term planning. So the Security Council has also been talking about that. And as early as 2021, they came out with a resolution that was quite clear that you need to be planning early for the transition and the withdrawal of a mission as early as possible, even ideally already thinking about, the roadmap to get towards sustainable peace and development as you are conceiving of the mandate of a mission, and then being able to follow through. And I think this early planning, as early as is feasible, has to be with the other partners, because again, the peace operation is not going to be able to do it on its own, not even from its first moments or throughout the life of the mission, never mind when it's winding down, because it has, in most cases or many cases, a fairly tailored mandate. And I think in future, the mandates will be even more tailored than perhaps what we've seen in recent years. So we need to be working together, and the IFIs have to be a part of that, to be working with us when these missions are being conceived of, ideally. But again, at least when we know that there is going to be some significant change on ground, transition, and then withdrawal, to make sure that we are able to preserve those peacekeeping gains or those peace operation gains, because most of the changes and transformations that peace processes are supposed to be entailing, if you will, are really long-term endeavors. And so it's not realistic to think that even in 5, even in 10, even in 20 years, that these things will be resolved. And so we need to make sure we plan for that. Secondly, again, it has got to be under national leadership, as I was saying before. And thirdly, we need to see how we support longer term institution building. So that's part of the early planning also. We know that if we don't have those institutions and processes in place, that again, the gains will not be sustainable. So as peacekeepers are withdrawing, and this is not just at the national level, by the way, it also should be at local level, we need to make sure that we are finding ways as partners across the board to strengthen those processes and institutions. And finally, we need predictable financing in order to be able to do this. And this is often the biggest problem in peace operations lingo. We often talk about the financial cliff that occurs when a well-resourced big mission is drawing down. There's often not much to replace it in terms of what they're bringing to the table, in terms of both capacities and very much the financing that's linked to that.
Great. I'd like to get some voices from the ground and looking at this effort to collaborate from a very specific context. And perhaps I can go to Dr. Fahemi now. Can you tell me from your perspective what the biggest obstacles are, practical obstacles, if you will, to effective collaboration between development and security actors on the ground, and perhaps what practical, realistic steps that you've seen in your own experience that can help bridge the gap?
Thank you very much, Chair, for the question, and Thank you for inviting me to the Fragility Forum. It's my first. I'm not a regular, like Elizabeth mentioned, but nevertheless, it's one that I consider very important. The discourse around security and development, particularly as it relates to security sector reconstruction, has been on for at least 2.5 decades now, and it's been cyclical. It gets attention and then it falls off the radar, and I'm glad it's back fully, I hope fully, on the agenda. But you're absolutely right that there's been tension, and she mentioned silos, operating in silos. That's very true, because when we conceptualize in the context of conflict, post-conflict reconstruction is often done in silos. We see peace building as different from nation building. And we want to automatically resolve peace building first. Disaster relief, humanitarian attention before we move to some of the embedded legacies of conflict. And yet you cannot resolve conflict if you don't deal with the root causes that provides that opportunity to even deal with the immediate issues. So they're inextricably intertwined. And we saw this in our own context on the continent, post-conflict Sierra Leone, post-conflict Liberia, post-conflict Cote d'Ivoire. And how you resolve that is even critical in the manner in which you set up the peace agreements. In the first instance, if you look at the Lome Peace Agreement in the context of Sierra Leone and look at the Accra Peace Agreement in the context of Liberia, one is more robust than the other. One learned from the other. The Lome Peace Agreement was primarily driven by the contestants. But in the case of the Accra Peace Agreement, civil society became embedded in it. And the concerns of civil society were reflected in terms of truth and reconciliation, justice commissions, and issues of economic opportunities comprehensively. So you have had that done. But what is also critical, if it's going to work well, is the regional conflict dynamics. And I think the Prime Minister mentioned that this morning. When you are able to resolve the issues locally, and you've even given room for local ownership, although the tendency that we've seen, at least in Africa, is that even though it's post-conflict situation that offers the best opportunity for security and development actors to work together most, the tendency is for that work to be more donor-driven than locally owned, because the resources needed to make that happen often come from outside. And those who bring those resources tend to want to also determine how you spend the resources. And there's even less coordination amongst them. I remember that, we produced a report for OECD DAC way back in 2005 on these issues, on how to deal with it. And I think once we're able to achieve that local ownership, we also must be mindful of what is happening in the regional dynamic, because many of these conflicts are not just local. They then attain international dynamics. In our case in Nigeria, and I'm glad Ambassador Nui is here, who will speak since it's more practically involved in the multinational joint task force. We were determined to ensure that we don't just see Boko Haram as a local issue. That it's an issue that involves Cameroon, Chad, Niger, and one of the ways Nigeria tried to deal with it was to achieve that multinational joint task force framework. And of course, some of that has its own challenges in recent times with the coup in Niger and the withdrawal of Nigerian troops from the multinational joint task force arrangements, but it's still one of the lessons that I think we must learn. So the first key thing that I've seen is that we must treat security and development issue in the context of fragility and conflict as a continuum.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to our online participants. You mentioned Ambassador Nuhu and the Lake Chad Basin. Of course, this is an extraordinarily important case study for the security and development nexus with a multinational military force, as you said, a regional development institution, all working together under a very, very serious operational pressure and political pressures indeed. Ambassador, perhaps can you tell us, how did that collaboration function in practice? I mean, there is some sequencing that's required, even in an integrated approach to the security and development nexus. Where did that sequencing break down? And looking at it now from your perspective, are there things that you would do differently in the security and development nexus from your own experience?
Yeah, thank you very much, moderator. I also want to thank the World Bank for the invitation extended to me to attend this very important forum. The Lake Chad Basin offers a unique and practical example of security development nexus in action, because the two institutions that are directly responsible for security and stabilization are housed under the same regional architecture, under the Lake Chad Basin Commission. On the one hand, you have the Lake Chad Basin Commission, which serves as... On the other hand, you have the Multinational Joint Task Force, which was mandated by the Lake Chad Basin Commission and authorized by the African Union, which serves as the regional security instrument. This arrangement has provided an opportunity to test in real time how security and development actors can work together under intense operational pressure. You asked what worked in practice. Well, the first lesson is that security and development interventions must be conceived as complementary rather than sequential activities. In early years of Boko Haram insurgency, there was this tendency to assume that military operations will have to finish first, the insurgents will have to be defeated, and the development actors will arrive afterwards. Reality proved much more complex. The MNJTF indeed did succeed in degrading terrorist capabilities, recovering territories, reopening critical transport corridors, and creating conditions for civilian return. However, whenever development and governance interventions fail to follow rapidly, extremist groups often re-emerge, exploited grievances, and re-established influence. This led us to adopt a more integrated approach. Through the Lake Chad Basin Commission's regional strategy for stabilization, recovery, and resilience, security operations were increasingly linked with stabilization planning. Areas liberated by security forces became priority zones for early recovery, restoration of basic services, livelihood support, local governance, and community reconciliation. The result was that security gains became more durable when communities began to experience a visible peace dividend. A second success factor was the establishment of regional coordination platforms that brought together military actors, governments, development partners, humanitarian agencies, and local authorities. I've already mentioned the Lake Chad Basin Commission, the Multinational Joint Task Force, and the Regional Stabilization Strategy. There is also the Lake Chad Basin Governors Forum and the Lake Chad Traditional Rulers Forum. These are some of the coordinating platforms and that really worked. These mechanisms improved information sharing and reduced the fragmentation that often characterizes interventions in fragile environments. The third lesson was the importance of community engagement. Security forces alone cannot build legitimacy. Communities become more willing to cooperate with security actors when they saw schools opening, when markets are functioning, when they see healthcare returning, and local authorities re-engaging. You also asked about where the sequencing broke down. Yes, despite these successes, several challenges emerged affecting sequencing. The first challenge was the mismatch in operational timelines. Military commanders often work on shorter timelines. In the case of multinational juntas, our operations are usually for a period of about 3 months maximum. Now, development institutions, on the other side, they have a longer term, just because of procurement processes, project approvals, fiduciary requirements, and donor procedures. This frequently meant that development interventions arrived much later than security gains. This created stabilization gap. That period between territorial recovery and development delivery, during which communities remain vulnerable. We have seen in the Lake Chad Basin Commission that extremists take advantage of this period to regain control of territories that were already liberated. The second challenge is the security and development actors often use different definitions of success. Military actors focus on territory secured, on attacks prevented, on insurgents neutralized, whereas development actors focus on livelihoods, governance, social cohesion, and service delivery. While both are valid, they are not always measured through a shared framework. The third challenge is that funding architectures are rarely synchronized. Security financing and development financing often came from different sources with different planning cycles, accountability mechanisms, and strategic priorities. As a result, interventions that should have reinforced one another sometimes evolved in parallel rather than in partnership. You also asked what to do differently. Well, with the benefit of hindsight, I would recommend 3 changes. First, we should move away from the traditional clear, hold, build model and move towards secure, stabilize, and develop model that brings all the 3 tracks much earlier and in parallel. This recommendation is rooted in a lesson that emerged repeatedly from the Lake Chad Basin experience. It shows that fragile environments rarely allow for neat sequencing. The traditional clear, hold, build model was developed largely from conventional counterinsurgency thinking, where security forces first clear an area of hostile actors, then hold it securely, and then afterwards, governance and development actors move in. In practice, especially in the Lake Chad Basin and other FCV contexts, reality has proven far more fluid. Rather than treating security, stabilization, and development as sequential phases, I advocate treating them as overlapping and mutually reinforcing tracks. The idea is not that every activity starts simultaneously, no, but that planning, financing, and implementation begin much earlier than they traditionally do. That is why development actors should be involved in planning before military operations conclude, not after. The transition from security operations to recovery should be prepared from day one. The second change is we need jointly owned metrics of success. Instead of measuring security and development separately, we should assess whether recruitment into armed groups is declining, whether displaced persons are returning voluntarily, whether markets are functioning, whether local governance is restoring legitimacy, and whether communities perceive improvements in safety and opportunity. These are the indicators that ultimately determine whether stabilization is succeeding. Then the third and final change is we need flexible financing mechanism capable of operating in insecure environments. The experience of the Lake Chad Basin demonstrates that most effective investments are often those that can be deployed rapidly in newly secured areas to restore essential services, create livelihoods, and reinforce community confidence before extremists can exploit the vacuum. Thank you very much. I would like to stop at this point.
Thank you. Thank you for that comprehensive look at the experience of Lake Chad Basin. I'd like to stay online and ask our guest from Somalia, Kamal Gatale, to talk a little bit about the Somalia experience. Somalia has seen some military progress against al-Shabaab, but actually translating these security gains into state presence and greater legitimacy has proven much harder. Can you tell us a little bit about how Somalia has thought strategically about this, how to translate those gains? Do we lose you? I think we might have just lost you. Do you want to check? In the meantime, maybe I will come back here to the panel and see while we get him. Have we lost him? Yeah, I'll try to come back to him. Okay, well, actually, following up on Ambassador Nu's point about the importance of flexible financing, making inroads in insecure environments, I want to go to Sheila Musimi from the World Bank Group to talk a little bit about how the World Bank, with its refreshed strategy, is dealing with. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and finish a question to Sheila, and then I will come back to you, if that's okay. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about how the bank's new strategy facilitates these partnerships, and in particular facilitates and can deal with the flexibility necessary to working in these insecure environments across institutions with very different rules and practices, in a siloed environment where the measurement and all these other things that have been come out in this panel. How does the World Bank manage around those complexities, and how have you seen the strategy? What lessons has the bank learned in its strategy to deal with that on the ground engagement?
Thanks, Joel, and it's very nice to be here and to see all of you joining partners from different facets of the development security landscape. So, the intersection between security and development is not something that's new for all of us. I think we've had all the speakers reflect a bit on what that is. In our new FCV, refreshed FCV strategy, there is this three-legged stool, so to speak, which has justice, then security and political stability, instability on one stool, and then jobs on the last stool. And when you look at those three legs, they're all needed for development to be sustained. They're all needed for our societies to thrive. And again, this wasn't new even in the outgoing FCV strategy from 2020, 2021. Looking back even further, that Joel will remember the WDR on conflict, security, and development. So these questions have been debated, and I think are seated very well with all of us in this space. I think what becomes interesting is how do you actually operationalize them, because we all have different mandates, and obviously you put a lawyer on a panel, and I'm going to talk very much about mandate and comparative advantage of each institution. So the new FCV strategy has these four strategic shifts: anticipate better, adopt a differentiated approach, and within that I can elaborate a bit more. Then deliver on this jobs agenda that you had a lot about this morning on all the panels this morning. And the last shift is enhancing knowledge and operational partnerships and staffing to make sure that we get this done well. when you look at all those strategic shifts, there is absolutely no way that any one of our institutions is going to be able to do this alone. If you think about anticipating better, you start to think about the kind of partnerships that we need to be able to do that, to anticipate better. And you had a little bit about that this morning with different tools that are being tried out with the Stanford Hoover Institute and many other tools that help us to really think ahead to where conflicts are going to be, where insecurity is going to arise, and how we can target much better. With a differentiated approach, same thing. You have countries at different levels of development, those in conflict, those in transition, those, they're just at the onset of conflict, and those in acute crisis. And all those need completely different approaches and overlapping partnerships to get this done. And so when we look at the mandate question, it's really, yes, legally, we all have our different mandates, and they help us, especially during times of funding shortfalls, staffing shortfalls in all our institutions. And I was chatting with Elizabeth about this at the onset. It's becoming increasingly difficult for us, for each of our institutions, to do everything everywhere. So we've got to be very clear about where, and very strategic in how we use the limited resources, leveraging on each other's strengths to be able to deliver in different situations. And so mandate is not just a legal issue, it's now actually a very practical thing that we have to all be aware of. And I think we can use that to our advantages. Being in the same room, I think the ambassador said very well, we've seen in all the countries that the complex situations that we work in, conflict doesn't stop the way it used to, and you kind of declare war over, and then development starts. There's so many overlapping areas, and we can go country after country in this element. I worked on Afghanistan years ago. Joel probably recalls that, and it was very hard in that continuum to say, sort of conflict has ended, humanitarian can kind of start, and then development can start. It's sort of, we all had to be in the same room at the same time, understanding the drivers of fragility, the drivers of conflict, the areas where we could move in, and the areas where now the sort of the humanitarian actors could move out of the room, and development, long-term development could actually start, but it never is a clear line. But why it's important, again, because of limited resources, we have to be super diligent and candid with each other, and allow ourselves the space to hear what development actors, security actors are saying, and be able to build on that. So I see different levels of partnership. One is, as the World Bank Group, we partner very much with the international players. So the UN agencies are critical, and actually built into some of our analyses, and in access to some of the IDA windows. So we have these windows under the fragility windows that IDA finances, where we actually need to have collaborated with the UN. There's data and information that we need from them. And so this is critically important for that. Then we have regional players listening to, the Lake Chad experience. You have African Union, ECOWAS, and other regional players who are critically important for both information, but also for continuing development work with us, in partnership with us and the countries. And then you have these non-governmental institutions, CSOs and others, that are critically important for us to deliver in different ways. Sometimes governments can't reach certain areas of the country, and so you need these third-party implementers who can come in. Anna Biade, our managing director, this morning talked about faith-based organizations as well, who have been very critical to reach certain areas. So those partnerships are critical as well. And lastly, but probably most importantly, as Elizabeth mentioned, is the country partnerships. Security actors within the countries probably know much more than many of us do, and being able to be in the room with them to understand the needs, to understand the constraints, those partnerships are really critical, and we are operating across that whole spectrum. So I will stop there for now.
Thank you very much. And I'm glad we have Kamal Khatali back. I was asking you about shifting from the military progress into the efforts to strengthen state presence and legitimacy in Somalia. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how Somalia has thought about this strategically, and where have you actually seen from your experience the gaps in sequencing or integrating stabilization and development, and the most acute gaps, and how you can deal with them from the Somali experience?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Joel, and thank you for the World Bank for convening this important discussion. First and foremost, just let me give you the complexity of the situation in Somalia, a bit background of the history, as well as the kind of insurgency that actually we are fighting in Somalia, Al-Shabaab, and how sophisticated they are, and then come up with some sort of peacekeeping missions that have been tried here and there, and what kind of military operations they have started, and liberation and stabilization efforts and sequencing, as well as the gaps that have happened in Somalia. So let me start with Al-Shabaab. They are not actually a simple armed group. They are very sophisticated insurgent and terrorist organization. They have adopted over many years, for the last 20 plus years, I think one of the longest insurgent terrorist organizations in Somalia. They call the wealthiest in Africa, more than even Boko Haram and others. And actually they are, fighting is in difficult terrain in Somalia, very long coastline that comes very illicit arms terrain, and rural communities with very weak infrastructure. And the challenge was re-establishing state authority across such a space and decades of collapse. It wasn't an ordinary stabilization task. It was one of the most difficult state building projects that actually we have as a government in Somalia. Secondly, just let me allude into the historic state collapse of Somalia that actually has become a prolonged civil war that began in the 1980s, and then state collapse in 1991. That's when the UN came with a peacekeeping mission in 1991 and 1992, and it has failed another around 10 years until AMISOM, the current peacekeeping mission from the African Union, has come. And that actually, it was in a wake that when the warlords era has gone, but another insurgency terrorist organization have started from 2006, challenging the interim transitional government at the time. So it was actually both the state collapse and the state institutions that collapsed, as well as the prolonged civil war, and that has come. And then again, we had a peacekeeping mission in 1991, which actually the issues of mandate and the issues of Security Council mandate has started with US intervention on humanitarian grounds, but it didn't have that kind of support, and it has failed at the time. And now we have this around 19 years old mission, AMISOM, which actually has done lots of stabilization. It has liberated the capital city. It has allowed the government to have a seat that actually rebuild itself, and for the first time, a serious state building project that actually the World Bank has come, and Somalia has achieved many things when it comes, including both HIPC status, as well as including lifting arms embargo and other important issues. On the liberation issue, I think 10 years ago, AMISOM has tried, because of the state weakness, they have tried to go ahead of the institution, and they have actually liberated many areas of Somalia. But actually, unfortunately, the state weakness has not, we could not take out the state behind those peacekeepers, and it became like isolated, liberated places only with foreign presence, but with no state authority and state extension of state legitimacy. And now suddenly, 3-4 years ago, actually the Somali government has done very big progress, military progress, that actually achieved to liberating around 600 kilometers of area. But actually the issue of stabilization has haunted them. What ambassador was saying, the clear, hold, and develop, actually that actually has got some gaps. And the gaps that actually I wanted to now to mention was, first and for all, there's a gap between the clear and the hold, which recovering ground is one thing, but holding it requires many stabilization efforts like policing, local administration, logistics, and predictable financing, as all our contributors have said. But also, we have a gap not only in the clearing and the holding, but also we have a gap in the holding and governing, where the security presence without courts, district administrations, and dispute resolution mechanisms gives you a deficit of legitimacy, and citizens need to see the state that is not only armed, but is also useful and accountable, as well as adding some of their, their life is to make it better. The third gap also was between the governance as well as what the government can offer in terms of livelihoods, markets, health, education, as well as jobs and other important government issues that actually can make economic recovery, as well as become some sort of serious recovery issues. That was actually the gap that those three gaps actually we have in terms of our the gap between liberation and stabilization. And lastly, I think what happened was Al-Shabaab also were trying to become a governance competitor to the government. They were not only fighting insurgents, they were also trying to provide some justice services, to give some humanitarian response to droughts, as well as, so they were trying to compete on that kind of soft approach, but not only on the ideological theological approach, but they were also doing some challenge, and the government also and its supporters sometimes their preparation of the liberation and the stabilization were some we had a lot of gap. I remember we have liberated some of the districts that actually the government authority and police and did not come. Maybe it took many months to come back. Finally, I need to actually conclude on the state capacity, which Somalia haunted that much. Somalia's tax to GDP is around 3%, very much less than 15% of the average of the region, East African region, and that actually gave the state, made the state did not get the legitimacy from its state, from its citizens, and make the state almost comparable with many other challenges, including federal member states, including others who actually contest the legitimacy of the state. So that's where I stop, and I think we need some sort of thinking on dual, not dual actually, but immediate. We need some sort of thinking. Our thinking should be when we liberating an insurgency, as well as when we are thinking about holistic thinking on the stabilization activities. It should be going hand in hand, as well as we need some sort of predictable financing for our forces and security operations. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to leave time for questioning, so I'm not going to ask a second round, but I will, if with the indulgence of the panel, if I can ask almost for a lightning round, in which each of you has literally sort of less than a minute. Given what you've said and what you've put on the table, if you had to prioritize one reform, one aspect, and I know there's no magic silver bullet in any of these things, but there are so many changes. I'm curious as what you would put as one high priority reform that you would like to see from the international actors, from the perspective of the international actors itself, the United Nations, the World Bank development actors, but from the ground up for those who are engaging with the international actors, what you'd like to see in terms of their reforms. Perhaps I can give you just an opportunity to throw one prioritized reform out on the table, and then I'm going to ask for questions from the audience. I didn't prepare the panelists for this. If you want to pass and think a little bit more about it, we'll go, we can. But I'd love to see if you want to put one thing on the table. Maybe if we can start with you, Elizabeth.
Sure. Thank you very much. And I have to say, I definitely agree with what all of my fellow panelists have been mentioning. I would certainly have also done the same had I had a bit more time, but I was trying to be mindful in terms of locally grounded approaches. Again, not sequential, really doing these things in tandem, and so many other important points that were raised. But in terms of reforms that I would like to see us do as the broader international community. Let me focus on UN in particular. And as you may know, our Secretary General has instituted a number of reforms that he is dubbing UN 80 reforms. And I think if we do get it right, especially certain parts of it, I think that could go a long way. And what I'm referring to in particular are the reforms that they are focusing on at the regional and at the national levels. The idea is to really empower our teams on the ground, role of the resident coordinator, how the different agencies, funds, and programs work together, and how we then can position ourselves much better vis-a-vis the IFIs and other actors, including bringing in the private sector, because where is the money going to come from? I think if we get that reform right, so that again we're breaking down the silos, we're working much more in very clear complementarity, making sure we're more effective and efficient, and finding ways to link up with much more effectively with these other actors. I'm working with my office, for example, on trying to bring in the private sector for peace-positive investing in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. That will be for another panel, another time. But we're also working increasingly with the World Bank and the regional development banks, so that we're more strategically aligned on ground in these contexts to deliver across security development and so forth. But we'll only be able to do that effectively, I think, if we can, at country level, do it better ourselves within our own system. Yeah.
Let me turn, Sheila, to you on the World Bank. What would you prioritize in the World Bank reform agenda?
No, an interesting thing that actually our board of executive directors was really key on, and our leadership is key on, is on something Elizabeth talked about on staffing. We are, when you look at the world right now, half of the world's extreme poor are in these fragile countries. And it's been something we've talked about for years and years and years. We need to incentivize the right people, the right boots on the ground to be in these countries to do this tough work. And it's been something that has eluded us continuously. And so with this new refreshed FCV strategy, we are putting a lot of focus on that. And why it's important, one of the elements you'll see is this notion of trajectory shifting actions that's in our new strategy. It very much needs, trying to do these trajectory shifting actions and make sure there's commitment in countries that are undergoing active conflict or conflict at different areas, needs a lot of hands-on support. We need to be in there with our partners to get this done. And it's partners at government level, but it's also partners in private sector level as well. So having the right people there to really roll up your sleeves and live among the people and try and get these things done, I think is something we have to focus on.
Dr. Fahmy, you've heard the reforms that the international institutions are thinking of making. What reforms do you think they should make?
Thank you. Well, first for me, I think the international actors, particularly the World Bank, need to begin to realize, and in many cases they do, it's just that it needs to be more structured, that these issues are more political than technical. And if you agree that they're more political than technical, then they also have to be humble enough to understand the power map. I'm not saying they should get into the partisanship in countries where they operate, but they need to understand the power maps in those places in order to shift the balance of power relations in favor of development. Because if you don't do that, it's just Band-Aid on bullet wound at the end of the day. For example, if you're going to deal with security sector reform, the question of the composition, the disposition of the military in the aftermath of conflict is a political issue. It's not a technical issue. And you must embed in it in order to ensure that it's not just the list that we get. Oh, post-conflict, you move from military to policing, or you reduce security expenditure. You may actually have to increase security expenditure, depending on the local context. of that power map I'm talking about. So I think that's one thing that international actors need to pay more attention to. The second for me is how their own countries, for want of a better word, use their own leverage in proxy wars that they're involved in.
Good point.
On the ground. I mean, World Bank often acts as coordinating mechanism for development partners in most countries in order to ensure that at least there is alignment and synergy. But within that broad spectrum, you tend to discover that some countries have more leverage than others. And they use that leverage to push agendas in the UN and in the World Bank that are not necessarily pro-development, but pro-national interest. How that works in the context of aligning security and development is something we need to work on more. Thank you.
Great points. And I'm going to turn to Ambassador Nuhu now. If you have a minute of what you'd like to see for reform from the international actors, and then I will go to Kamal Gutale. Ambassador, I think you're on mute. Yep, you're still on mute. You want to try it again? Well, in the meantime, I'm going to go to Kamal, and then we'll try to return to you if we get you on off mute. Kamal?
Yes, Joel, I think I agree with the gentleman who was ahead of me. I'm thinking that, I was preparing for this meeting. I was looking for the FCV strategy 2020-2025, and I really have got something very important that has been articulated in the strategy, which was, the bank to invest in security sector reform and where it necessarily. And then looking from that, if I give you an example, Somalia has done its first national security architecture. It's like the political security model that Somalia adopted in 2017. And then we have revised in 2023. And then that actually has been agreed by all political stakeholders at the federal and state level. That's the political agreement for the security sector management and security sector approach for the country. But it never got someone to invest in it. So I believe investing in security sector reform and security sector development is very important. We have to differentiate between investing in security, like not investing in weapons, investing in tactical wars or something like that, but just really from affordability point of view, legality point of view, capability point of view, there is even logistic point of view. We have UN whole UN mission that actually supports the logistical management of both the peacekeeping mission as well as supports our Somali National Army. But we don't have actually now. If the UN leaves, our army doesn't have the management, the skills that actually it requires to be that kind of mission. And to support those logistics, the development community ignores the security as it is hard security. But I can tell you maybe over 50-60% of the security, there is so many soft approaches that actually make sense, not only in terms of affordability, in terms of legality, in terms of capability, but something that can become a state building approach on the security sector. So that's actually where I'm thinking that IFI is to support and become aggressive about it and adapt it as a strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And let's try to go back to Ambassador Nuhu if we figured out how to get him off mute.
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm really sorry that I wasn't able to get out of that point very quickly. Yeah, I would want to prioritize decentralization as a reform, because when properly designed and implemented, it helps bridge the critical gap between stabilization and development. It creates the local ownership, trust, and responsiveness that are essential for preventing a return to conflict. For the Lake Chad Basin, the opportunity is not simply to decentralize authority. It is to bring governance closer to the citizens, to strengthen state legitimacy, and transform security gains into lasting stability and development. That is where I think my priority should be. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, that does leave time for questions. We have the opportunity for people to ask questions online, and they will be transferred to me to ask to the panelists. But of course, we'll start here in the room for anyone who'd like to ask. Please introduce yourself briefly. Let me know what your question is, and if you want to direct it to any particular panelists.
Thank you. E.J. Hochner with the Atlantic Council. There's been a lot of, well, this is for the institutionalists, for the UN, for the World Bank. Apologies. There's been, a lot of push for this question or this issue of flexibility of funding. But I think related to that, and to some degree, speaking to the issue that Ambassador Nuhu raised, is the question of political risk or the riskiness of investments, right? And this question of, you want to be quick, you want to be flexible in terms of your funding, but the institutional constraints of funding riskier projects are a real one. And I'm just wondering how the UN and the World Bank kind of wraps its head around that issue of you need to be investing in these very uncertain environments. That's very risky, and that is going to be challenging for your staff.
And can I add to that? And I'm going to ask you to respond. And we do have an architecture that's created over the years that deal with environmental issues, sort of social safeguard issues, the very complex political questions that fit within the mandate issues that Sheila has raised. There's a whole apparatus that has been developed over time that is really not designed to work in environments as politically complex as this, as dangerous as this, as risky and as uncertain as this. I often sort of say, if you look at operational documents from the World Bank, this is not from the UN side, the risk section is at the end, and it's a couple of paragraphs where the risk section in any of these true contexts, as you've heard from our panelists, it's all about risk. Risk is the central proposition of the operational engagement. How do you sort of see trying to work operationally within the international context in which the UN and the World Bank have to exist, but take on the kind of risk that you mentioned?
With very finite resources, I would add, right?
Yeah.
No, you touched really, AJ, on a really critical point. When we're working in these fragile settings, risk is all over. And now imagine, I'm speaking from mostly a sovereign perspective, with the World Bank going in to finance, energy, foundational infrastructure that's needed for jobs to come in, for the private sector to come in. But now think about it from the private sector point of view. Where you find actually development actors are incredible. The local private sector is incredible and resilient, even in places like Gaza, just staying in and investing and continuing the work in there. But when you talk about foreign investors coming in, the risk profile is out the roof. And I think what you found our institution doing is trying to find ways to help manage this risk. We have the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency that has actually a very ambitious goal. They really want to up the number of guarantees that they're doing to try and encourage the private sector to go into these risky environments. We had in our IDA 18 replenishment this window which was created to try and encourage private sector, more private sector by IFC and MIGA to go into these tough areas. So it's a constant area of learning, growth, pushing ourselves to see where we can mitigate risk to the extent possible to enable development to happen. But Joel, you also touched on an interesting point about sort of our standard policies on environment and social, on procurement, on all these other elements. And I go back as well to the issue I spoke about on staffing, getting people into these areas who can do this hands-on implementation support. The bank has really, we've pushed ourselves as much as we can to really work in these areas. And having more boots on the, having more people with expertise to help our countries navigate, because in the end, we want development to be sustainable. We don't want to throw out the rules, which are important. Otherwise, you're going to have, corruption. These are areas where things can really, really go wrong. Damage to environment, as the Mozambican president was talking about today. You could have development taking place without rules, and that's not going to help anybody. So we do need the rules. We need them to be flexible, and we need people on the ground to help the governments to build the capacity to do that. While I have the mic, my neighbor here provoked me very a lot in his remark, and I do want to respond a bit on that element. There has been periodically a push for institutions like the bank, international financial institutions, to do more in areas that are traditionally political areas, and for some of them are very clear for us. It's not an issue of preference. It's really an issue of core mandate for us. So elections, that's really not something we can get involved in. Financing the military, those are things we cannot get involved. And actually, you don't want us to get involved in them because we do not know how to do them. Yeah. So what we are doing more of, which over my many decades now of being here, is we're doing more of being in the room, of getting these assessments done in countries. So we have these risk and resilient assessments, which really look at the whole trajectory of what's happening in a country. And those things we can do. We can sit in these meetings, we can understand these issues, and they very much inform how we design operations. We need them also critically, as I talked about the different buckets of countries, how they are going to be listed. We need that information to be able to put the countries in those buckets. But really, at the end of the day, it's not a matter of preference for us. It's a matter of legality, where our mandate starts and stops. And it would be really helpful for all of us to understand each other's mandates so that we can then help each other to help the countries the best. So, thanks.
Can I ask Elizabeth if you have thoughts on the risk issue in question?
Yeah, thank you very much. I would say a few things about that. First of all, yes, we do always talk about flexibility of funding in these kinds of cases, and it's extremely important precisely for the nature of FCV context, right? There's a lot of volatility, and if you're not able to pivot and adapt as things evolve or devolve, as the case may be, then you could be really supporting in certain areas or in certain ways that are no longer relevant, right, as things change. But yes, it can be risky. So similar to what you were saying, I mean, we have to be better risk informed, of course. That is something that we work on always in terms of projection, conflict analysis, risk assessment, and so forth. We're also trying to invest a lot more in prevention. And we've had that discussion with the World Bank now for some time about really working more upstream in context so that the risks that are already out there perhaps can be mitigated earlier before it becomes really the situation becomes unmanageable. That's a certain approach as well. We also have to realize that we're not always the best instrument for everything. So, for example, in terms of the UN, we do believe very much in supporting civil society in fragile and conflict-affected settings, in very high-risk settings. But in terms of getting the resources directly to small grassroots organizations, we have too many rules and regulations, and they're there for a reason, right? To protect the resources. We have a due diligence towards that. And so we look at other means, which is to sometimes channel resources either through our agencies, funds, and programs, who are on ground, or through international NGOs. But we're not always, the right instrument for certain things. Thirdly, I would say we have some instruments that are helpful. My office manages the Secretary General's Peacebuilding Fund, which was precisely set up as a source of catalytic funding that is risk tolerant and that can go in with reasonable but still modest amounts of money to test certain approaches and hopefully come up with a proof of concept of something that is a good support in that country in whatever field it might be, and then can be brought to scale by others, right? So we have that instrument precisely to try to be reacting to those kinds of of situations. And then fourthly, I would pick up on your point about needing to stay engaged. And I think we simply have to realize that there are also very high risks of and costs of not engaging in these settings. So we have to keep finding the best ways to do so. But I think we've seen in so many different contexts how we have not engaged fully, or we have stepped back. Haiti is one country that always comes to mind for me in that respect. And then we have to go back more substantially with a far costlier scenario in terms of all of the lives that have been lost and, of course, the monies that have been spent. And maybe just a final thing on this issue of the traditionally political areas. I mean, it is an interesting discussion between the UN and the World Bank and others. So on the Development Bank side, vis-a-vis the UN, which is, yes, it's a political institution. As was said also, really much of the development work that is being done is political in many ways, and certainly security sector reform and governance is a political area. So is justice, so is DDR. But when you're talking about the three-legged stool of jobs, justice, and security, you have far more wherewithal in terms of resources than we do, and those two other legs beyond jobs are absolutely critical. So if you can also support in those areas, I think it would be incredibly important. And just as an illustration, last part of my point on how important it is to bring those together, the security and development, you look at an area that we're working in also very assiduously from our office, which is demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration of former combatants. And our colleague from Somalia was certainly talking a lot about that, as well as Ambassador Maman Nuhu. And we wouldn't expect the bank to get into supporting directly disarmament or demobilization, but reintegration is largely about development. And if those things don't come together at the right time, right away, and those peace dividends are not evident, and they are not working in tandem, we will fail on the DD, and that means we will fail in terms of security. So in a way, everything's political, and we're very understanding of that. But if there are ways that, for example, in public expenditure reviews in the security sector, which the bank has been involved in at various points, that is an incredibly useful job that you do. So let us keep trying to see how we can collaborate also in these areas that, yes, have maybe more of a political tinge, but where there are aspects that hopefully the bank could invest in. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the question at the end.
Thank you very much, Glaucia Boyer, with the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I see that stabilization is at the core of this discussion, almost as a glue that binds together security and development. And this is reassuring. Stabilization is at the core of our practice. I almost see here and read from the contributions that there is call for even more support, more engagement in this stabilization. So I would be very keen to hear from the panelists, but in particular Ambassador Nuhu, about, in his experience, what are the types of operational arrangements and operational and financial arrangements, I would say, that have actually, in partnerships, that have actually worked to close this gap. And we need to do that, of course, quickly on the ground. So yes, thank you very much.
Ambassador Nuhu, this is directed to you if you'd like to take it on.
Yes, I will talk briefly about it. Now, in the Lake Chad Basin Regional Stabilization Strategy, we did experience that funding gap, which actually turned out to be to have reduced the effectiveness of the strategy. That was the first phase of the strategy. Now we are in the second phase, and there is this recommendation to establish a funding facility. It did not receive, as of 2 months ago when I left the Lake Chad Basin Commission, it had not received the kind of attention that we anticipated. Germany has been pushing for it, but I'm not sure now who is on board and who is not on board. But I am convinced that that Nexus funding facility is capable of bridging this gap that we are talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to go to some online questions, and Miguel will read them out.
Sure. Yeah, so we have a few questions from online. So one is P.S. Gutale discussed how Al-Shabaab offers an alternative governance model similar to the Islamic State in the Lake Chad Basin and other armed groups around the world. How can security development partnerships collectively counter this local entrenchment? That's one question.
Maybe if I can go to Kamal, did you hear that question?
No.
I hear that
Kamal?
question. Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah,
Thank
we see
Joel.
you.
I was really interested to say something about the issue of risk taking on
Please.
the advice ground. You know, maybe Miguel knows that, but many of the World Bank country team in Somalia, they are based in Nairobi, and I think that affects their effectiveness in Somalia. So I can say, you know, many of our teams are actually, you know, spent lots of time abroad just to meet those kind of development experts in based who supposedly to support Somalia's mission. So I think, I mean, taking the risk to come on the ground, I think is very important, and I really want to flip the argument on it comes to how we can make sure the risk on going the ground, but also from our side is also very important to those development experts sitting with us as well as spend lots of time within our time. On the second question, like when insurgencies or terrorist organizations try to compete with the government on the soft side, I think it's very important to also look back on yourself on what's their comparative advantage. In the case of Al-Shabaab, it was like they saying we are. Their selling point were we are mostly on the judiciary side, on the courts. It was two things. One is free from corruption. Second, it was enforceability. And whoever goes to them, he will get a fair chance to be listened to, and then they can call someone, and then they say if you don't do that, like if they are in, they will listen. Mostly, I don't know if I can make the case correctly, but just their comparative advantage is enforceability of what they have, because they either kill you or you will implement whatever they say. So whereby our law enforcement agencies, they cannot enforce, or maybe there is some corruptions, even though our courts can rule something, but they cannot enforce for you. So you need to clean your system. You need to fight corruption. You need to try to also not to give them access to communities. And I think that's actually we have successfully achieved many of that, and now I think they are all. There is when we came 4 or 5 years ago, I can tell you there is so many cases. Many people used to go to Al-Shabaab courts, but now I think they are not in the surroundings of the capital, as well as on many big cities have been liberated. And second thing, we have fought corruption in terms of courts. And the courts now in Somalia has been televised. Actually, your court cases can be televised, and you can view online what you can all many of the court cases. So you have, as long as you can fight corruption, the only thing that's missing is the enforcement that you cannot televise. But also we need to digitalize many of the enforcement proceedings, and we need to up our game when it comes to law enforcement. I think that's where we can fight them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kamal. Perhaps we can get the last question in from online.
Yeah, and another question is also, how can IFIs provide support to governments in context where governance of sovereign territory is being contested within while still remaining apolitical?
Shill, that's an easy one.
That's for her.
Yeah, this is a live issue in many of a few of our countries, and so it's a really good question. So we have a few situations where you have two contesting governments. Quick one comes to mind is Yemen, but there are a few others I could mention as well. Sudan is also still in active conflict with some parts being claimed by the RSF. So in those situations, there are a few elements that we look at. One of them is we have an assessment that we do of whether there is a de facto government situation here. Who is the de facto government? And that's when you've had a government that has come into power through unconstitutional means. And in those situations, we can do the assessment to see who is actually de facto in control of the country. One critical thing about our apolitical mandate is we do not recognize governments. We deal with governments in power. So this assessment is not for us trying to get out. It's actually us trying to find a way to deal with whoever is in government to be able to provide services to the country. Now, if we do assess that one particular government is de facto, there is still the element that the questionnaire has raised, which is there's a part of the country that doesn't have, the de facto government cannot reach. And that's where partnerships are incredibly critical. UN partners tend to be very present in some of these areas. ICRC also would be in some of these areas, but again, there it depends on whether the activity is more on the humanitarian side of the development humanitarian nexus. And then you also have some local partners who are on the ground, but we've tended to rely heavily on our UN partners to be able to provide development assistance in those areas. And then maybe just one thing that I should say, I had responded to Dr. Fayemi about what we cannot do because of our political mandate, but there's a lot we can do, which many partners actually don't know. But I have to say also, the partnership has been helpful in pushing us also as far as we can go in our mandate. So we appreciate these conversations. Public expenditure reviews are a strength of ours. We do these all the time, and we also include security, the security sector as part of those public expenditure reviews. But again, it's all client-driven. They have to request for it. We do it in partnership. IMF does it as well. So we complement those efforts, and we want to lean in under this new strategy to do that. And there's a number of other areas. The R in the DDR is something we definitely do. We do parts of the second D, the demobilization, like IDs and things like that. We definitely can't do the first D, which is disarmament. But so there's a lot that we can do. Yes, we do. We do reconstruction. Absolutely. So the livelihoods, the reintegration is. Security sector is not a strength that we have, not technical strength. But yes, this has been fascinating.
Well, I'm going to ask you to pass the mic to Dr. Fayemi, because I'm going to ask you to give us the last word then. Look, you've stressed the importance of understanding the politics as you run an incredibly complex politics of these environments. You've heard about some of the constraints about acting upon that knowledge. Just as a last word, given what you've heard, how do you think you navigate that boundary of understanding the politics versus being able to act upon the politics?
Well, that's why I use the word power map rather than getting dirty within the context of politics. But if you don't understand the power map, you don't understand the players, affecting the environment may be more difficult. So ditto for development too. We have to do development with the people rather than to the people on the ground. Thank you.
Well, that's a great thought and sentiment to end on, because I think that's something that we can all agree on in this very fraught and difficult context. But let me thank the panelists for a very, very rich discussion. Let me again recognize Elizabeth Spehar, Dr. Fayemi, Ambassador Nuhu, Shila Musimi, Kamal Gutale, for your insights, your thoughts, your suggestions for reform, an agenda for change, and a recognition of what can be done in these very, very difficult contexts. And let me thank the World Bank for hosting this as part of the Fragility Forum, and thank all of you for your questions and for your engagement both online and here in the World Bank headquarters. Thank you all very much.